This lecture accompanies Chapter 9 of your textbook, specifically the part of the chapter that focuses on genetics. So, what is behavioral genetics? Behavioral genetics focuses on how personality traits that are different across people are passed from parent to child and shared by biological relatives. Behavioral genetics is not concerned with traits that are the same for everyone. Like we all feel love and we all get hungry and we all appreciate beauty. That's not what behavioral genetics is interested in. Rather, behavioral genetics is about the traits that vary across individuals. In other words, behavioral genetics examines how genes influence broad patterns of behavior, personality traits, in a phrase. So we are going to discuss how genetics influences behavior and how genetics has been studied and its association with behavior specifically. But first, we're going to start with the history of genetics, which is pretty sketchy, namely because of eugenics and cloning. So eugenics is the belief that humanity could and should be improved through selective breeding. The term eugenics was coined in 1883 and basically means well-born. And so the original definition of eugenics is, quote, the science of improving stock, not only by judicious mating, but whatever tends to give the more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing over the less suitable than they otherwise would have had. So maybe you are most familiar with eugenics by knowing about the activities of the Nazi Party and the Holocaust, which was driven by a belief that there were things, that there is a race, there are races, and one race is more superior than another. It didn't actually start with the Nazis. Sadly, it actually started here in America in the 1900s. The majority of our universities had courses that focused on eugenics. And we even, in the United States, had an American Eugenics Society who would sponsor these better baby or fitter family competitions and award blue ribbons to the finest human stock, however that was defined. And eugenicists have also always been interested in the prevention of poor breeding, and that is through sterilization. The state of California was actually at the forefront of the American eugenics movement and performed something like 20,000 sterilizations over a 50-year period. And that accounts for a third of the nationwide sterilizations that were done during that time. In terms of policy, we have also seen eugenics show up in the Immigration Act of 1924, which limited the number of immigrants allowed to enter into the United States and completely excluded immigrants from Asia. We've seen something like this more recently with President Trump's ban on certain countries of Islamic faith. In 1927, the Supreme Court said it was okay to force women to be sterilized if they were mentally feeble. So basically, eugenics is bad, and that, unfortunately, is where behavioral genetics began. But luckily, we have moved away from that as far as I can see. Cloning is also a bit of a problematic process. Potentially, it could be used for bad reasons. Cloning is the process of taking genetic information from one living thing and creating identical copies of it. And the copied material is called a clone. So geneticists have cloned cells, tissues, genes, and entire animals. An example of where cloning has been both good and bad, or valuable but also unethical or problematic in the way it was done is the story of Henrietta Lacks. If you aren't familiar with this story, I highly recommend checking out the documentary or the book, or there was also a fictionalized biological film starring, I think, maybe Oprah Winfrey. Basically, what happened with Henrietta Lacks is that she had this very pervasive uterine cancer, and they took her cells from her uterus without her permission, successfully cloned them. These cells are now called HeLa cells, and they were used in biomedical industries to accomplish a number of major research efforts. And they've been used to look at different diseases, to do gene mapping, to look at the effects of toxic substances on organisms and radiation. And Henrietta Lacks, until more recently, has not been recognized for her contribution, and the family had not been compensated for the unethical and maybe even illegal use of their family members' tissues. Dolly the sheep, I think, is the first mammal ever cloned, and they produced a sheep from by using cells from a 6-year-old sheep. That was done in 1996. So what is a gene exactly? We're talking about genetics, but we haven't talked about a gene. Simply stated, a gene is a section of DNA that codes for proteins. So a gene contains the instructions for proteins, which then build cells and enzymes and so many other different things that eventually result in our individual characteristics like eyes, color, and hair color. The human genome contains over 20,000 protein encoding genes. And so let's look more specifically at what I mean when I say that the gene has instructions for building things. So genes in and of themselves are not what makes you you. They're instructions that tell a cell to make molecules, to make proteins, and proteins enable a cell to perform special functions. So DNA might instruct a cell. Here's the gene, and the gene may instruct the cell to make a protein, a structural protein that's used to build a neuron, which is then in turn used to facilitate neural circuits. And other genes may participate directly in the function of the neuron or the function of the system. And it's from these complicated interactions that we see psychological functioning. Another complication is that genes can modify the activities of each other, and certain genetic factors can be turned on and off depending on exposure to different things. And so it's a highly complex situation. Genes, some important basic terms that you need to know to understand anything you're going to read about behavioral genetics. One is, what is an allele? Well, genes mutate, and so when they do, they can take 2 or more alternative forms. So an allele just refers to a form of a gene. So a gene might have a short form and a long form, and those forms are called alleles. And they're just characterized by small differences in their sequence of DNA bases or the structure of their chromosomes. So, for example, the gene that codes for the serotonin transporter has several alleles, and one of which, when expressed, when that specific form of that gene is expressed, turned on, it causes a vulnerability to depression. What is a genotype? A genotype is your genetic structure. It is a simple description of which alleles you have for a certain gene, and it may be a description of your alleles for a number of genes. The phenotype, when we say phenotype, we're referring to what are the set of observable traits in each of us. A phenotype can also refer to a behavior or a behavioral phenotype, a pattern of personality traits. So genotypes are the biology, phenotypes are how that biology is expressed outwardly. Finally, epigenetics is the study of heritable changes in gene expression that does not involve changes to the underlying DNA. So basically, epigenetics focuses on studying how the phenotype changes when the genotype doesn't change. How do we study behavioral genetics? Well, to talk about this, we need to make sure that we're on the same page in regard to what dizygotic versus monozygotic twins are. Those are just fancy words for identical, monozygotic, or fraternal, dizygotic twins. So identical twins are born from the same egg, whereas fraternal twins are born from two different eggs. And it's helpful to study identical fraternal twins and siblings because of the differences in genetic overlap. Monozygotic or identical twins, because they both come from the same egg, have 100% overlap in terms of their genome. They have the same genome. So if we see any differences in their personality or their behavior, we can assume it comes from the environment. Fraternal twins share about half of their genes, and this is also true of parents and offspring. So most of the studies on genetics focus on twin studies and adoption studies. Adoption studies don't have to be with twins, but there is a very interesting, problematic, and unethical study that occurred that did use twins and triplets to study genetics and to study the nature versus nurture debate. That study has been depicted in a documentary film called Three Identical Strangers, and it involved several sets of twins and triplets. As part of your in-class activity for this chapter, you're going to watch a couple of video interviews with the twins and some of the triplets that were unwittingly involved in the study. And I also highly encourage you to watch Three Identical Strangers, which is a documentary about the study and about this one set of triplets in particular. I was hoping to show it to you, but it requires that you watch it through Amazon. Unfortunately, it can be rented for something like $3.99, but it was not letting me play it on Zoom. So unfortunately, you'll have to try to watch that on your own. But as a replacement, I have posted a couple of video interviews. So adoption studies are probably the simplest and most common way to look at behavioral genetics. Links between the biological parents and the child that is adopted are usually explained by genetics, whereas any links or connections we see between the adoptive or environmental parents to the adopted child, we attribute to the environment. So for example, one adoption study found that shyness in adopted children was related to their biological parents, but not to their adoptive parent, suggesting that shyness is genetic. Cross-fostering is the rat equivalent of human adoption studies. You take different litters of rats and you look at how they behave. And then you impregnate them, and you, once the rat pups are born, you change their mothers, and you see if the behavior in the offspring is more similar to their quote-unquote adopted rat mothers or more similar to their biological rat mothers. Embryo transfer is like cross-fostering with a twist. Here, scientists actually take out the fetus when the fetus is in utero from one mother, and then we'll transfer it to the fetus to the uterine environment of another mother. So it is more complicated. And then when the rat pups are born, you switch them again. And here you can compare what aspects of behavior and biology are due to uterine environment versus parenting versus biological genetic matches. There's a statistic called the heritability coefficient, and it's based on the assumption that traits and behaviors influenced by genes should be more similar among those people who are more closely related. So this heritability coefficient is used to summarize the extent to which a particular phenotype or trait, like extroversion, might be attributed to variation in genotypes. So it's a correlation that's used to compare similarity in personality differences between people who are and who are not related to different degrees. So this heritability coefficient is an average. It's not an absolute. And it's super tricky because it's said that full siblings share 50% of variability in their genes, but that's technically a theoretical average. Any one pair of siblings might show, 30% overlap or 60% overlap. So it really varies. However, if we focus on twins versus siblings or twins versus adopted siblings, we can get a heritability coefficient. So in terms of what defining a heritability coefficient, I want you to think about it as the percentage of variability in a trait in a population that can be attributed to variability in genes. So it's not 50% of this trait is due to a specific gene. It's that we see that 50% of the variability in this trait is due to this 50% of variability in these genes. So it's estimated in general when we talk about personality that on average 40% of the variance in personality, so 40% of individual differences in any one personality trait might be accounted for by genetic variance. So as you can see, it's kind of a tricky statistic to wrap your head around. This is in your chapter. This just shows how the heritability coefficient gets calculated. And so you can get a sense of what the score is really telling us. So on the left side of this graphic, you see a theoretical set of identical twins. Actually, 3 pairs of identical twins. So here they have filled out a measure of, let's say, extroversion. And this twin of pair 1 scored a 54, and there's the second twin of this pair scored a 53. And so that's one pair of twins, that's a second pair of twins, that's a third pair of twins. Then you look at how their scores are correlated. Then you take a set of fraternal twins and you do the same thing. So here's the first pair of fraternal twins, second pair of fraternal twins, and third pair of fraternal twins, just as an example. But you do many more pairs than just 3. And then you look at how well their scores are correlated. So here we see that fraternal twins' scores are only correlated 40%. So the difference between these two correlations is 0.20. But the way that the math works out is that you have to multiply that by 2, which gives us 40%. I don't want you to worry about the math. I just wanted to walk you through this to give you a sense of what this is actually telling us. It's telling us how similar are these fraternal twins, how similar are these identical twins, and how different are those two similarities. What does heritability tell us about the influence of the family? Does the family context even matter? Some argue that genetics matters more than family context. And they argue this because they see that adopted children who are raised in the same family correlate, their behaviors tend to correlate at like 0.05, which is very, very small. Not p.05, but a correlation coefficient of 0.05. So that's not very much correlation. However, most of this research has focused on self-reports. So other researchers argue we can't say that genetics is the only thing that matters for behavior. There's some very clear evidence that family context is critical for certain outcomes. So we see that family context matters more than genetics when we look at things like delinquency or aggression or attachment style. We see that family context is more important for psychopathology, certain forms of psychopathology. So depression is partially accounted for by the family. One important exception to this psychopathology research is ADHD. So ADHD is highly genetic. ADHD is not influenced by the family context. It is very genetic. It is as genetic as height. And it's been found, the research on these outcomes and genetic versus family influences, the research is strongest when you use behavioral observation rather than self-report. What does heritability not tell you? It doesn't actually solve the nature versus nurture puzzle. You can't use a heritability coefficient to determine what % of a trait is determined by genes versus the environment. Also, traits with little variation will have a heritability of 0. So if you try to compute the heritability of 2 arms among people, and you try to correlate the presence of 2 arms in pairs of twins and 2 arms of pairs of siblings, and you try to calculate that heritability coefficient, it's going to be 0 because everybody has 2 arms. Does this mean that having 2 arms is not biologically influenced? No, it's just that since there's no variation, there's nothing to explain. So heritability explains variation. What heritability can't tell you also is it's not super informative about how genes affect personality. So we know that genes affect our propensity to engage in certain behaviors, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we are going to be the same way. So for example, television watching appears to be heritable if you do twin studies and adoption studies. But there's no specific gene for TV watching. It's just that genetic variants are associated with things like sensation seeking or lethargy, and those things contribute to whether we watch a lot of television or not. Divorce is also seemingly heritable. If one or more of your close relatives have been divorced, you're more likely to get divorced than if none of your relatives had been divorced. And that's even if you never meet these relatives. What does this finding imply? It implies that there is one or many genetically influenced traits that are relevant for divorce. So we might think here about impulsivity or other forms of psychopathology. What heritability can tell you is that genes do matter. It's complicated because genes operate differently depending on a lot of different things. Some genes only get expressed if certain other genes are present, or will express themselves in different ways in different environments. Even members of the same family may grow up and live in different social contexts, even though they technically grew up in the same house. My brother and I we're 6 years apart. We grew up in the same house. We are very, very, very different. So what does a heritability statistic really tell you? It tells you that not all of personality comes from experience. There is some portion of variability in our personality that can be linked to genes. So if you just took a learning-based approach to looking at personality or a behaviorist approach to studying personality, you would miss a lot because there's stuff going on biologically and genetically. Second, it provides a window into non-genetic effects. It can help us understand how important the early environment matters in shaping personality by seeing when genetics doesn't exert an extreme influence on something. So except for a few traits like depression and anxiety and aggression, a lot of research has suggested that the shared family environment doesn't seem to matter very much. And that's certainly the case with ADHD. The family environment doesn't matter. It's more due to genetics. Research has moved beyond twin studies and correlations between relatives to focus more on molecular genetics. And so by diving directly into the minutia, the DNA particles, molecules, scientists are trying to determine whether differences in traits are correlated with differences in a particular gene. So this is where alleles come in. These are variants of a gene. So different alleles can be associated with different outcomes. One example is the DRD4 gene. This gene we know codes for dopamine receptors. And so certain allelic variations of the DRD4 gene are associated with sensation seeking and ADHD. The 5-HTT gene affects serotonin, and there are two major alleles or forms of this gene, short forms and long forms, and we find that short forms of the 5-HTT gene are associated with things like neuroticism and a stronger activity in the amygdala when a person is exposed to negative stimuli. Research is also moving toward looking more at gene by environment interactions. Genes are not causal. They only provide the design or the instructions. So this means that the gene affects the behavioral phenotype only indirectly by influencing biological structures and physiology as we all develop in an environment. So what do I mean by this? So you could inherit a short stature and experience a lot of teasing, and then your personality may be affected. But there isn't necessarily a gene for your personality being a certain way. It happened as a result of this cascade. So the recent Joker movie is interesting when thinking about the biological vulnerabilities and how the environment can exacerbate them. Choice of environments. People tend to choose or create environments compatible with genetically influenced tendencies, but they might do so in different ways. So you take two people with the allele of a gene associated with greater sensation seeking. For whatever reason, one of those people, even though they have the same allele, they pick a set of friends who race cars, and the other picks a set of friends who steal cars. The latter is arrested, but that outcome was not due to the allele alone. Finally, environments can affect heritability itself. So we can think about nutrition as an environment, and height is a good example. Heritability will be higher when all children have the same level of nutrition. Then we know that genetics is going to play a bigger role because there's less variability in the environment. So where every child receives adequate nutrition, then height heritability is going to look like it's 100% heritable. Whereas where there are communities where people are starving, variability in height will fall more under the control of the environment. And so heritability will appear to be lower. This is an example, a real example of a gene-environment interaction. In this study, they found that people with the short allele for the 5-HTT gene, again, this is the gene that I just mentioned that codes for serotonin receptors and transporters and things. So people with this allele, they especially are more vulnerable to depression if they have been exposed to a greater number of stressful life events. So in this figure, if you look on the right side of this graph, these are stressful life events here on the x-axis. And among people who had, 3 or 4 stressful life events, you see that it was the people with the SS allele who had the highest number of depression symptoms. But if we look to the left side of the graph, among the people who had 0 stressful life events, their genetic makeup actually didn't matter. So it's not that the 5-HTT gene might always result in greater depression if it's a short allele form. It might have to depend on whether the person is exposed to stressful life events. So finally, epigenetics, as I mentioned, refers to non-genetic influences on a gene's expression. So how does stress and nutrition affect not how our genetic makeup looks, but how it's expressed? So how the genes are translated into behavior. Especially early in life, our environment can influence how or whether a gene is expressed. So the gene might be the same as it was in our mother, might be the same as it is in our offspring, but there's something about the environment that changes the way the gene is expressed, and that is what epigenetics is. And some researchers are trying to use epigenetics to identify the environments that work best for certain people depending on their genetic makeup. The future research is going to be focusing on how genes affect personality. One study found patterns of genes were associated with all big 5 traits except extroversion. But only the genetic pattern associated with agreeableness was consistently demonstrated across all studies. So let me say that once again. A study looked at the big 5 traits and how connected each of the big 5 traits were to genetic makeup. At first, it seemed like all the traits, except for extroversion, might be connected to genetic makeup. But it turns out that really it's agreeableness that seems most strongly connected to genetics, and extroversion is not connected to genetics, according to these studies. The big picture is going to be super complicated, but hopefully this short lecture gave you some idea into how behavioral genetics is being used to study personality.